Come on. Why are you standing there like you're in the shower? Close the door quickly. Everything's going to flood right now. Listen, didn't I tell you a story about a guy who got a job as a cleaner in a shopping mall when he was a student? It was a story I heard from him directly. One late night over a forgotten cup of coffee, a tale spun with a fragile, haunted urgency that suggested it had been burning a hole in his soul for quite some time. He had a look in his eyes, a kind of permanent shadow, that told me he wasn't just recounting events, he was reliving them. And as he spoke, you could almost feel the cold, oppressive silence of that place settle around us, hear the echoes of things that shouldn't be. He had just started his studies, you understand, something in business, he'd told me. Driven, bright, but like so many young people today, burdened by the ever-present weight of tuition fees and living costs. That's why he'd taken the night cleaning job, a practical solution to a financial problem. The hours were brutal, he'd admitted, from midnight until the first faint streaks of dawn, but the pay was decent, and crucially, it left his days free for lectures and library sessions. The setting was a vast, sprawling shopping center on the city's outskirts, a labyrinth of glass and chrome that felt utterly alien once the last shoppers had departed and the fluorescent lights hummed with a different, more somber tone. He often spoke of the immense solitude that engulfed him during those shifts. Once the security guards had done their rounds and settled into their back-office cubicles, the world of bustling commerce transformed into an echoing mausoleum. His mop bucket and squeaky cart were the only sounds for what felt like miles, reverberating off polished marble floors and the towering facades of shuttered shops. He told me how the silence itself began to feel like a presence, a heavy blanket that pressed down on him, amplifying every creak of the building, every groan of the ventilation system. It was during his initial training, he recalled, that his new colleagues had first introduced him to the local lore. Old Man Henderson, a grizzled veteran of the cleaning crew, his face a roadmap of cynicism and bad habits, had been the first to bring it up. Henderson, in his gravelly voice, had imparted a warning, saying something about certain stores having a history, a lingering stain that even the strongest bleach couldn't erase. He chuckled without humor, then pointed with a gnarled finger towards a particular section of the mall, a sleek, modern-fashion boutique nestled between a forgotten electronics store and a brightly lit cafe. That particular store, Henderson had explained, was where it had happened, years ago now, maybe a decade or more. He'd described a horrific incident, a mass murder, a family gunned down by a deranged worker, or perhaps a jilted lover. The details were always a little fuzzy, evolving with each retelling. The official story, he'd said with a dismissive wave, was that it was a robbery gone wrong, but everyone who worked the nights knew better. Henderson had recounted that the spirits of the victims, a mother, her 2 young children, and a terrified shop assistant, were said to still roam the mall, trapped, bound to the very polished floors Elias was now tasked with cleaning. They'd particularly favored that specific store, Henderson had insisted, where their lives had been so brutally cut short. Another colleague, a younger woman named Sarah, who often shared a quick, whispered tea break with him, had corroborated the tale with a chilling earnestness. She'd admitted that she never dared to clean that part of the mall alone, always making sure old Henderson was nearby, or at least that she could see his distant figure. Sarah had revealed that she had heard things herself, late at night, when the mall was most quiet. Faint whispers carried on the non-existent wind, the distant patter of small feet, and sometimes, the undeniable sound of a child sobbing, thin and reedy, seeming to emanate directly from the sleek glass facade of the fashion boutique. She had warned him to avoid it if he could, to just give it a wide berth and stick to his own designated areas. Elias, being a man of logic and science, a student of the practical world, had naturally dismissed these stories as mere superstitions, the idle chatter of bored night workers trying to inject a little drama into their mundane shifts. He privately thought they were just trying to scare the new guy, a kind of bizarre hazing ritual. He might have smiled politely, assuring them that he wasn't prone to flights of fancy, and that he certainly didn't believe in ghosts. He told me that he'd actually found their tales somewhat amusing at first, a quirky local legend that spiced up the otherwise dull routine of mopping floors and emptying bins. But then, the shifts began to blur into a monotonous rhythm, and the initial amusement had started to wane. His routine became second nature. He'd start in the food court, move through the main concourses, the various retail areas, the restrooms, until finally, he'd reach the wings where the quieter, more upscale boutiques resided. And it was there, as the nights grew longer and the silence became increasingly profound, that he began to notice things. It started subtly, as these things always do, he'd explained. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, a whisper of air that wasn't the ventilation system, a scuffing noise that couldn't be explained by the building settling. His ears, he'd realized, had become preternaturally attuned to the mall's nighttime symphony of mechanical hums and distant creaks. Anything outside of that familiar orchestra of mundane sounds would snag his attention. He'd first heard it on a particularly still night, a night when the air was heavy and even the building seemed quieter than usual. A faint, almost melodic hum, like a distant lullaby, seemed to drift from the direction of the fashion boutique. He had paused, his mop resting against his cart, convinced it was just his imagination, or perhaps a speaker left on by mistake. He had waited, listened intently, but the sound had faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the familiar hum of the fluorescent lights. He'd shaken his head, attributing it to fatigue, a trick of the mind. The incidents, however, began to increase in frequency and clarity. Weeks turned into a month, and the vague, indistinct noises began to sharpen into something more identifiable, more unsettling. He'd often find himself cleaning a distant corridor, only for a sharp, distinct crack to echo from the direction of the boutique, like a high heel striking marble, followed by a light, almost skipping sound. He'd freeze, his heart giving a small jolt, and strain his ears, but inevitably, silence would follow, thick and unbroken. He tried to rationalize it, convincing himself it was the expansion and contraction of the building materials in the cooling night air, or perhaps just a stray piece of debris falling. But then came the whispers. He'd be near the boutique, perhaps cleaning the opposite side of the broad concourse, when he'd catch a fleeting, hushed murmur, as if someone were speaking just beyond his range of hearing. It was never distinct enough to make out words, just a breathy, sibilant sound, like multiple voices speaking at once, indistinct and overlapping. A shiver would run down his spine, despite his logical mind's insistence that it was merely an acoustic illusion, an echo, or the faint sounds from the security office somehow carrying through the vast space. He'd often stop his work, standing perfectly still, holding his breath, waiting for a repeat, but the sound would always dissipate, leaving him alone in the profound quiet. The children's crying was what truly began to chip away at his composure. It was a sound no adult could easily dismiss, especially not in an empty, desolate place. He'd be on the upper level, wiping down the railings, when a thin, reedy wail, unmistakably a child's sob, would seem to float up from the lower floor, from the very spot where the boutique stood. It was not a loud, demanding cry, but a soft, mournful sound, full of a heartbreaking despair that twisted something in his gut. He told me that it sounded so real, so utterly genuine, that his first instinct was always to rush down, to see if some child had been accidentally locked in after closing. But he knew that was impossible. The mall was always thoroughly checked. Yet the sound would persist for a few agonizing seconds, before abruptly cutting off, leaving him with a racing pulse and a cold knot of dread developing in his stomach. He started to avoid that section of the mall altogether, taking longer detours, cleaning the furthest reaches of the shopping center first, saving the areas near the boutique for last, when the first faint stirrings of dawn might offer a glimmer of reassurance. He'd admitted to me that he was beginning to feel a creeping sense of unease, a pervasive dread that gnawed at the edges of his reason. The stories that his colleagues had dismissed as mere superstition now played on a loop in his mind, their warnings taking on a new, sinister weight. He'd started to question his own sanity, wondering if the sleep deprivation, the isolation, and the sheer monotony of his work were finally getting to him. One night, the sounds became unbearable. He was cleaning the floor directly in front of the boutique, driven by a perverse need to confront whatever it was, to prove to himself that it was all just in his head. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of hushed voices seeming to swirl just beyond the pristine glass doors. He could hear the distinct sound of tiny footsteps, a quick patter-patter as if someone small were running back and forth within the store. And then, the crying began, not a single sob, but a simultaneous, overlapping chorus of two children crying, one high-pitched and piercing, the other a softer, more mournful whine. It was too much. His heart hammered in his chest, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. He told me that a cold sweat broke out on his brow, and his hands, clutching the handle of his mop, began to tremble uncontrollably. He knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that these were not the sounds of a building settling, or an acoustic trick, or a tired mind playing games. These were sounds that should not exist, sounds that spoke of a presence within that dark, silent space. A powerful, almost irresistible urge overcame him then, a desperate need to see, to know what was inside. He rationalized it, telling himself that he had to confront it, to put an end to the torment, to prove that it was all just a figment of his imagination. He had to dispel the fear, once and for all. He approached the glass doors of the boutique, his footsteps echoing too loudly in the sudden silence that had descended as he drew near. The crying stopped, the whispers ceased, the footsteps vanished. Only the hum of the distant fluorescent lights remained. He pressed his face against the glass, peering into the gloom. The store was dark, save for the faint ambient light filtering in from the concourse, casting long, distorted shadows among the display racks. He could make out the mannequins, standing rigidly in their silent poses, their blank faces staring out into the empty space. Everything seemed normal, utterly mundane, perfectly still. He let out a long, shaky breath, convincing himself that he had been foolish, that his mind had indeed played tricks on him. He'd felt a wave of relief, quickly followed by a flush of embarrassment. Turning to walk away, a new thought struck him, a chilling premonition that stopped him dead in his tracks. If there was nothing there, if it was all in his head, then why did the sounds always stop when he drew near? Why did the silence feel so heavy, so expectant? He found himself turning back, a morbid curiosity overriding his fear. He reached for the store's service entrance, a small, unassuming door tucked away near the back of the boutique, accessible only to staff. His fingers, he'd observed, fumbled with the key, a cold, metallic object that felt heavy and resistant in his shaking hand. The lock clicked with an unnervingly loud report, shattering the oppressive silence. He pushed the door open, a sliver of darkness widening into a gaping maw, revealing the inner sanctum of the boutique. The air inside was different, he'd remembered, colder and heavier than the air in the concourse, carrying a faint, almost metallic odor he couldn't quite place. He stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind him, plunging himself into near-total darkness, save for the slivers of light from the mall seeping through the display window. He pulled out his phone, its flashlight beam a small, inadequate spear against the vast shadows. The first thing he noticed was the profound stillness. The sounds that had tormented him for weeks were gone, swallowed by the thick, silent air of the shop. His breath hitched in his throat, and every scrape of his shoe on the polished floor seemed to reverberate. He swept the beam of his phone across the racks of clothing, the empty cashier counter, the plush changing rooms. Everything appeared to be exactly as it should be, neat and orderly, waiting for the morning's bustle. Then, his gaze fell upon the mannequins. They stood arranged in small vignettes, displaying the latest fashions, just as they always did during the day. But something felt off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it at first. The way the light caught their featureless faces, the angle of a limb, the tilt of a head. He moved closer, his heart thumping like a trapped bird. His flashlight beam lingered on a particular grouping. A tall, slender female mannequin, her arm outstretched, seemed to be gesturing towards a smaller, child-sized mannequin beside her, whose head was slightly bowed, as if in contemplation. Nearby, another child mannequin, a little boy, had one arm raised, as if reaching out. He remembered these displays, had seen them countless times from the outside. But, were they exactly as he remembered? He swept the light to another part of the store. A collection of adult mannequins, arranged in a tableau that suggested a lively social gathering, now seemed to be huddling together, their backs turned to the rest of the store. And then he saw it. The subtle, yet undeniable shift. A mannequin that had always stood by the storefront window, a headless torso artfully draped with a scarf, now stood closer to the center of the store, its headless form angled towards the back. Another, a male figure in a suit, had definitely shifted his position, his hands, which had previously been casually tucked into his pockets, now rested stiffly at his sides, as if at attention. The most disturbing change, however, was in the arrangement of the faces. Or rather, the direction of the faces. Many of the mannequins, he now noticed with a jolt that sent a tremor through his entire body, had subtly turned their heads. Their blank, painted eyes, which had always stared impassively forward, or towards an adjacent display, were now angled. He swept his light across them, one by one. And to his horror, he realized that a significant number of them, perhaps every third or fourth figure, seemed to be looking directly at him. The child mannequins, in particular, unnerved him the most. The little girl he'd seen earlier, her bowed head, now seemed to be staring straight ahead, her painted eyes fixed on his position, a chilling blankness in their gaze. The boy beside her, his arms still raised, had his head tilted just so, as if curiously observing him. He felt a primal terror grip him then, a cold, suffocating dread that stole the air from his lungs. It wasn't just that they had moved, it was the implication of the movement. It suggested intention, observation, a conscious awareness. He felt watched, scrutinized by dozens of unblinking, unfeeling eyes. He could almost hear the whispers again, not from around him, but from within the silent effigies themselves, a hushed chorus of unseeing voices. He told me he didn't scream. He couldn't. The terror had rendered him mute, paralyzed. His mind, usually so sharp and logical, had completely fractured. What little light his phone cast seemed to dim, swallowed by the profound darkness and the palpable presence that now filled the store. He felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to escape the silent judgment of those lifeless forms. He didn't remember opening the door, or stepping back out into the concourse. He merely found himself there, gasping for breath, leaning against the cold marble wall, the distant hum of the mall lights a welcome, if still inadequate, sound. He had run then, he said, run faster than he ever had in his life, abandoning his cleaning cart, his mop, his entire shift, without a second glance. He just ran, out of the mall, into the blessedly cold, familiar night air. He never went back to that job, of course. He found another, a day job, one that paid less but offered the precious gift of sunshine and the comforting presence of other people. He finished his studies, graduated, and built a successful life for himself. He tried to forget that place, those nights, the creeping dread that had burrowed into his bones. But you could see it in his eyes, even years later, that permanent shadow. He'd never been able to fully rationalize what he saw, or what he felt. He often wondered, he'd confided in me, if the mannequins had moved again after he left. If they had continued their silent vigil, their painted eyes scanning the deserted aisles. He wondered if the children's cries still echoed in that store, if the whispers still drifted on the midnight air. And he wondered, most chillingly, if they were still looking for him. Okay, enough horror for today. Wait a minute. The phone seems to be going dead now. I need to plug it in. Although, where are you going in this weather? Do you remember Brian? His uncle worked as an electrician. He gave us a real scare once with his story. They say that old Sterling Mall, the one you probably remember standing empty for years before they finally tore it down, held more than just dust and forgotten memories. They say that when the lights went out, certain things stepped out of their corners, things that thrived on silence and the lingering despair of failed commerce. And they tell a story about a crew of electricians who went in there one winter, assigned to bring its dead arteries back to life. A dark, winding tale, you might call it, one that still makes some people look over their shoulders when the sun dips below the horizon. The job, as the story goes, was monumental. Sterling Mall, once a bustling monument to consumerism, had been deserted for nearly a decade. Its wiring, a sprawling, archaic network of copper and insulation, was deemed a fire hazard by the city, a condition for any potential redevelopment. So, a crew was dispatched, tasked with the Sisyphean labor of repairing what amounted to the mall's decaying circulatory system. There was Marcus, the lead foreman. A man built like a brick wall, pragmatic and unflappable, or so he believed himself to be. He trusted only what he could see, measure, and, of course, wire. Then there was Chloe, his younger, sharper apprentice. Her mind was a steel trap for diagrams and schematics, her skepticism a shield against anything that couldn't be quantified. Ben was next, an earnest young man whose enthusiasm sometimes bordered on anxiety. He was good with his hands, but less so with his nerves. And finally, Silas. The oldest of the crew, a man of few words and perpetual shadows. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his eyes seeming to absorb more than they relayed, and he rarely offered an opinion unless directly asked, and even then, his answers were often cryptic. Their hours were inverted. The mall, during the day, was a cavern of echoes, workers from other trades moving like ghosts through the dust-filled aisles. But their job started when the last of the sunlight bled from the sky, and the security alarms whirred to life. As soon as the main power grid was disconnected, plunging the vast complex into an oppressive, absolute darkness, that's when they stepped inside. Their work was to fix the old, unreliable emergency circuits, to untangle the knotted threads of its past, and replace them with new, clean lines. They wore headlamps, their beams carving weak paths through the monumental gloom, their toolboxes clanking like spectral chains in the silence. On that first night, Marcus had told them the job would be tough, requiring long hours and absolute focus. He had declared that there would be no room for slacking or carelessness. Chloe had nodded, already mentally mapping out the sections they needed to tackle. Ben, a little too eager, had asked where they should start. Silas had simply pointed a gnarled finger towards the furthest, darkest reaches of a deserted department store, a gesture that already felt heavy with unspoken meaning. As the hours stretched, the initial awe of being alone in such a vast, dormant space began to curdle into something else. The mall seemed to breathe around them. It wasn't just the natural settling of an old building, it was a rhythmic creak, a distant groan, as if the very structure was shifting, watching. Their headlamps, usually a comfort, now seemed to shrink their world to a claustrophobic tunnel, leaving the endless, hungry darkness to press in from all sides. Chloe had been the first to notice the lights. Not theirs, but the remnants of the mall's own emergency system that they were trying to repair. A faint, sporadic flicker from a distant section, a ghost of an old fluorescent tube struggling to ignite. She had mentioned it to Marcus, suggesting it might be a surge from a faulty line they hadn't isolated yet. Marcus had simply grumbled that it was exactly why they were there, wasn't it? He had told her not to worry about what wasn't their immediate concern. Then, the tools began to vanish. It started with minor things. A pair of pliers, a screwdriver. Small, easily misplaced items in the sprawling chaos of old wiring and debris. Ben had been the first to complain, claiming he had just laid his wire strippers down on a junction box, only to turn back and find them gone. He had looked around, asking if anyone had seen them, his voice echoing too loudly in the silence. Marcus had accused him of being disorganized, reminding him that tools cost money and time. Chloe had suggested they might have just been knocked off the box. Silas had offered no explanation, merely retrieved a spare from his own kit and silently handed it to Ben. But the disappearing acts continued. A wrench, a roll of electrical tape, then a measuring tape Marcus himself was sure he had just used. Each disappearance fueled a quiet, simmering resentment. Each person began to eye the others when an item went missing, a silent question hanging in the air. Are you messing with me? The whispers started subtly. Faint, indistinct murmurs that seemed to drift on the cold air currents of the mall. They were always just out of earshot, like a forgotten radio playing in a distant room, or the dying breaths of a cavernous space. Ben, jumpy as he was, had been the most affected. He had paused his work, tilting his head, asking if anyone else heard it, a soft, sibilant sound, like dry leaves rustling or paper sliding over stone. Marcus had attributed it to the old vents, or the building's acoustics playing tricks in the dead of night. Chloe had suggested it was their imaginations, tired and overstimulated. But Silas, she had noticed, had simply stood still for a moment, headlamp off, listening intently to the darkness before resuming his work without a word. By the second night, the strangeness had intensified. The flickering lights were no longer distant and sporadic. They were closer, more insistent. Entire sections of wiring that they had isolated would suddenly spring to life with momentary, blinding flashes, only to plunge back into darkness. It began to feel less like a fault and more like a deliberate act. Shadows, too, seemed to gain a life of their own, stretching and contracting in ways that defied their headlamp beams, writhing at the edge of their vision. The whispers, however, were what truly began to fray their nerves. They were clearer now, almost discernible, like a collective sigh or a hushed conversation just around the next corner. They seemed to follow them, growing louder when they were alone, retreating when they huddled together. Ben was openly terrified, his hands trembling as he worked. He had mumbled something about the mall being haunted, suggesting they should simply abandon the job and report it. Marcus had scoffed at the notion, reminding him that they were professionals, not ghost hunters. He had told Ben that fatigue was making him paranoid, and that they had a deadline to meet. Chloe, despite her initial skepticism, found herself constantly scanning the shadows, a prickle of unease growing on her neck. She tried to rationalize it, air currents, echoes, the mind playing tricks, but the explanations felt thin, inadequate. It was during the second night that a critical piece of equipment went missing, the main circuit tester, a device essential for their work. Marcus had raged, accusing Ben of gross negligence, demanding to know where he had put it. Ben, white-faced, had emphatically denied any knowledge, swearing he had left it right next to Marcus's toolbox. He had even suggested that perhaps Marcus himself had moved it and forgotten, or that Chloe had borrowed it. The accusation hung heavy in the air, creating a palpable rift. Marcus had said he expected better from his crew, especially when time was of the essence. Chloe had tried to mediate, suggesting they retrace their steps, but the trust was already fractured. Silas, as always, had said nothing, but his eyes, when they occasionally met one of theirs, seemed to hold a profound, unsettling knowledge. The third night was when the real unraveling began. The lines between their imaginations and reality blurred into a terrifying, indistinguishable mess. The whispers were no longer just indistinct murmurs. They spoke. Not in clear, understandable sentences, but in fragments, in suggestions, in accusations that seemed tailor-made for each of them. Chloe heard her name called from the darkened food court, a voice that sounded eerily like her mother's, telling her she wasn't good enough, that she would never amount to anything. She had spun around, convinced someone was playing a cruel trick, but there was only the vast, echoing emptiness. She started to suspect Silas, remembering his strange, knowing glances. She wondered if he was a saboteur, or perhaps unhinged. She found herself watching him from the corner of her eye, trying to discern his silent intentions. Ben, already a nervous wreck, started seeing things. Fleeting movement at the periphery of his vision, shadows that shifted into forms, only to dissolve when he focused. The whispers for him were malicious, telling him that his crewmates were talking about him, calling him weak, incompetent, a liability. He started flinching at every sound, every sudden movement from Marcus or Chloe. He became convinced one of them was deliberately trying to scare him, to make him fail. He had openly pleaded, telling Marcus that they needed to leave, that the mall was not right, that it was dangerous. Marcus, however, had simply grown colder, his frustration hardening into stone. He had told Ben to pull himself together or he would be left behind. Marcus, the unshakable foreman, was perhaps the most frighteningly transformed. The whispers for him weren't about fear, but about betrayal. They told him his crew was conspiring against him, undermining his authority, delaying the job out of spite. They seemed to confirm his suspicions that Ben was clumsy, that Chloe was too clever for her own good, that Silas was quietly working against him. His pragmatism curdled into aggressive suspicion. He started barking orders, his voice raw with exhaustion and fury. He began locking up their shared tools, forcing them to ask his permission to use anything, claiming it was to prevent further theft. He accused Chloe of deliberately misfiling schematics, and Ben of intentionally cutting the wrong wires. He even subtly moved some of Silas's personal tools, just to see if he would react, convinced Silas was playing some silent game. Silas, the quiet observer, remained an enigma, but his actions became increasingly unsettling. He would often turn off his headlamp and simply stand in the absolute darkness, listening, for unnervingly long periods. He would sometimes offer to help one of them, only to subtly misplace a necessary component, or hand them the wrong gauge of wire, then offer a wordless shrug when confronted. The others, already frayed, began to interpret these actions as deliberate acts of sabotage, or perhaps, a sign that he was losing his mind, driven by the same unseen forces that tormented them. Chloe, once a staunch rationalist, began to wonder if Silas was feeding the entity, or if he was merely a vessel for its malevolence. The turning point was ugly, as they say. They were working in the decrepit main fuse box room, a cramped, claustrophobic space deep in the mall's belly, and the air was thick with the smell of ozone and old dust. Marcus was barking at Ben, accusing him of miswiring a critical junction. Ben, on the verge of tears, had shouted back that he had followed the diagram exactly, blaming Marcus for giving him faulty instructions. As their voices rose, a live wire, seemingly disconnected, suddenly arced violently, spitting blue fire inches from Ben's face. He stumbled back, hitting the wall, terrified. Marcus had shouted that it was Ben's carelessness, but Chloe had seen it. She had seen Silas, standing just behind Ben, a subtle, almost imperceptible twitch of his hand towards the exposed wiring just moments before the arc. Her heart froze. She wondered if he had done it on purpose. She cried out, asking Silas what he was doing. Silas had simply looked at her, his eyes unreadable in the dim light, and then, he had reached out and effortlessly snapped a brittle, ancient wire, plunging the entire room into absolute darkness. Panic seized them. Ben screamed, a raw, animal sound, convinced that one of them was trying to kill him. Marcus roared, demanding to know who was playing games. Chloe fumbled for her headlamp, her hands shaking, her mind racing with the image of Silas's hand. The voices, no longer whispers, but clear, distinct accusations, now echoed around them in the darkness, each of their names called, each of their perceived failings laid bare, each of them told that the others were to blame. When the emergency lights finally flickered back on a few agonizing minutes later, their beams revealing their terrified, sweat-streaked faces, the crew was no longer a unit. Ben was huddled in a corner, sobbing, refusing to look at anyone. Marcus stood over him, accusatory, his face a mask of rage and fear. Chloe, trembling, stared at Silas, who was calmly, deliberately, gathering his tools, his face impassive. She was sure she had seen him do it, but the darkness had been so absolute. the confusion so overwhelming. The whispers continued, now seeming to come from within their own minds, telling each of them that the other three were the true danger. The story gets hazy after that, you see. No one knows exactly what happened in those final hours, or how many more nights they endured. Some say the crew was found, scattered, incapacitated by madness, their minds shattered by whatever they encountered in the dark. Others claim they simply vanished, swallowed by the mall's vast, hungry maw, 2 of them gone without a trace, the remaining 2 discovered wandering the streets days later, incoherent and babbling. The official report, of course, cited extreme fatigue and a series of unfortunate electrical mishaps as the cause for the incomplete repair job. But the mall, when they finally decided to tear it down, still held its secrets. The wiring was never fully repaired. And sometimes, even now, on quiet, windless nights, when the moon is thin and the air is still, people say you can hear faint whispers drifting from where old Sterling Mall once stood. Whispers that seem to ebb and flow, like a conversation just beyond your grasp, asking if you've seen the others, if you know where your tools have gone, if you truly trust the person standing beside you. Remember how I said the old Sterling Mall was supposedly breathing? Well, it turns out its legends didn't disappear with the dust. They just moved. Sometimes I think what we consider abandoned is just waiting for its next victim. Like the night security guard at another seemingly ordinary mall. His shift started when the cameras went on and ended when he couldn't believe what he was seeing anymore. You might have heard tales of abandoned malls, those hollowed-out monuments to consumerism, left to crumble under the weight of time and neglect. But there's a story, a peculiar one I was told, about a mall that was never abandoned in the conventional sense. Oh no, it's still operating, thriving even by daylight. Its glass doors slide open for throngs of shoppers, its escalators hum with ceaseless ambition, and the scent of synthetic vanilla and cheap perfume perpetually hangs in the air. Yet, when the last customer is ushered out, and the heavy security gates clank shut, something shifts. The air, it's said, becomes heavy, almost viscous. The silence, when the rumble of the ventilation system finally dies down, is not an absence of sound, but a presence itself, an expectant hush that waits. This is the story of Arthur, a man who knew that silence intimately. His job began when the light faded, when the last vestiges of the day world retreated from the polished floors and vacant storefronts. He was the sole guardian, the night watchman of the Grand Emporium, or whatever it was called these days. Names change, but the structure remains, a vast, labyrinthine organism of steel and glass, designed to funnel desires and pry open wallets. Arthur's duty was simple, almost insultingly so: monitor the cameras. He was told, repeatedly, that no living soul could get inside once the locks were engaged and the alarm set. The mall was a tomb from dusk till dawn, sealed and impervious. His role was merely a formality, a human cog in a machine of absolute security, a silent witness to nothing. You see, for months, that's exactly what it was. Nothing. Hour after hour, Arthur would sit in the dim glow of his monitors, a constellation of flickering green and gray images stretching before him. He knew every blind spot, every quirk of the aging surveillance system, every phantom shadow cast by the emergency lights. The flickering fluorescent tubes in the vast, empty halls, the silent mannequins staring blankly into the abyss, the neatly stacked clothes in unreachable displays, these were his companions. He'd sip lukewarm coffee, absent-mindedly trace patterns on the dusty console, and count the minutes until the first sliver of false dawn promised the return of the living. It was a monotonous existence, punctuated only by the occasional false alarm from a settling building or a scurrying rat. He once recounted how the boredom itself was a kind of an opiate. It dulled the senses, smoothed the edges of the mind, making one susceptible to the mundane, to the expected. That, he believed, was its most insidious trap. One Tuesday night, a night much like any other, perhaps a little colder than usual, Arthur saw it. A flicker, Not a glitch in the feed, not the usual artifact of an old camera, but something distinct, a subtle shift in the carefully orchestrated stillness of Aisle 7, Department Store West. It was just a glance, a fleeting movement that the human eye might easily dismiss as a trick of tired vision. He blinked, rubbed at his eyes, and leaned closer. The screen, however, showed only the immaculate display of designer handbags, undisturbed. He dismissed it as fatigue, as the creeping tendrils of a long night wrapping around his perception. He told himself it was nothing. But then it happened again. This time, it was in the food court, a blur near one of the overturned chairs, a ripple in the otherwise stagnant air. It was too quick for him to truly ascertain, but it was there, undeniably. He felt an unwelcome spike of adrenaline. His heart, usually a placid drum, started a hesitant, quickening beat. His mind scrambled for logical explanations. A reflection? A moth caught in the camera's view? He checked the external sensors, the door locks, the motion detectors. All green. All secure. No ingress, no indication of a breach. He found himself leaning forward, elbows on his knees, eyes glued to the screens, a cold dread beginning its slow unfurl in his stomach. The mall, his familiar, empty domain, felt different now, charged with a new, unsettling energy. He swore he could feel a prickle on his skin, a sense of being watched, even though he was ensconced in his secure, windowless booth. Then came the sustained movement. Not a flicker, but a slow, deliberate glide. It was a shape, indistinctly human, drifting through the electronics section. It seemed to float, rather than walk, its form shimmering at the edges, like heat haze over asphalt. It paused before a display of television sets, its shadowy head tilting as if examining the prices, its gestures oddly mimetic of a late-night shopper. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. He tried to rationalize it, to force his mind to accept a prosaic explanation. A hallucination? A prank by a former employee who knew the security system's weaknesses? But the utter silence, the impenetrable nature of the building, argued against it. As the shape moved, another appeared. And then another. They were not solid, not truly corporeal, but more like distortions in the fabric of space, dark blurs against the muted tones of the mall. They moved with an unnerving grace, not interacting with one another, but each engaged in its own silent, spectral perusal of the deserted stores. One seemed to trace a finger along a dress in a boutique window. Another stood by the perfume counter, its form rippling as if inhaling a scent that wasn't there. They were browsing, Arthur realized with a jolt that sent a tremor through his hands. They were buyers. Then the whispers started. At first, he thought it was the hum of the old server, or the subtle whine of the cooling fans in his booth. But the sound was too articulate, too close. It was a chorus of faint, sibilant voices, layered and overlapping, like silk rustling in a mausoleum. They were calling out names, it seemed, indistinct at first, then coalescing, growing clearer, colder. And then he heard it. His own name. Arthur. It was a breath, a caress of sound against his eardrums, reaching him despite the thick glass and concrete walls. It seemed to come from everywhere, from the walls, from the ceiling, from the dark corners of his booth. Arthur. We're here for you, Arthur. A shiver of pure, unadulterated terror ran down his spine. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a malfunction. What he saw on the screens, what he heard in the suffocating silence, was real. And these buyers, these spectral shoppers, were not after discounted goods. They were after him. He frantically flicked through the camera feeds, demanding a rational explanation from the silent monitors. But they offered none. The spectral figures were now moving with more purpose, their forms becoming slightly more defined, like charcoal sketches gradually gaining depth. They were no longer wandering aimlessly. They were converging. And their whispers, a chorus of hungry sound, grew louder, more insistent. Come to us, Arthur. We have a special offer, Just for you. He was frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, his throat constricted by a terror so profound it felt physical. He was alone, utterly and irrevocably alone, in a sealed building with things that should not exist, things that knew his name and desired something only he possessed. He tried to switch off the monitors, to plunge his world into darkness, to sever the connection to the horror playing out across the mall. But his hand trembled, refusing to obey. He couldn't look away. He had to watch, for some primal part of him understood that knowing where they were, seeing their approach, was his only defense. The figures on the screens were now moving with a chilling coordination. One glided down the main aisle, its shadowy arm extended as if gesturing towards his location, a silent invitation or a dire command. Another ascended an escalator, its form rippling as it passed through the inert handrails. They were closer, exponentially closer than they had been moments ago. The whispers were no longer an echo, but a direct address, a seductive lure. Your soul, Arthur. It's what we seek. A fair trade, wouldn't you agree? For peace. For endless rest. He pressed his back against the cold, hard wall of his booth, as if trying to merge with the concrete, to disappear. He clutched the small, worn crucifix he always wore beneath his shirt, its cold metal a faint comfort against the icy grip of fear. He told himself it was a nightmare, that he would wake up to the sound of his alarm, to the mundane promise of another day. But the sound of his name, whispered from 100 unseen mouths, was too real, too present. The figures seemed to become aware of his gaze. They started to turn, slowly, in unison, towards the camera lenses. It felt as though they were looking directly at him, through the lens, through the wires, through the very fabric of the mall itself. He could almost feel their cold, insubstantial breath on his face. Their forms, now facing the cameras, seemed to solidify further, revealing vague outlines of what might have once been faces, now twisted into expressions of yearning, of an insatiable hunger. He heard them speak of a boundless curiosity, a desire to experience the richness of human life, even if only by consuming it. They spoke of the mall as a temple, a place of convergence for desires, and how his fear, his very essence, was the ultimate commodity. Their voices promised him liberation from his earthly burdens, an end to his lonely nights, if only he would yield. His eyes darted from screen to screen. They were no longer browsing. They were hunting. Their movements were no longer aimless. They were deliberate, an intricate dance of pursuit. He saw one phase through a locked store gate, its body rippling like water. Another climbed onto a display counter, its elongated shadow stretching towards the camera as if reaching for him. The lights in the security booth began to flicker. Not the monitors, but the overhead fluorescence, plunging the small room into momentary darkness, then back to an anemic glow. Each flicker was accompanied by a surge in the whispers, a collective gasp of anticipation. He understood that they were testing the boundaries, finding the weaknesses, not of the mall's physical defenses, but of his own resolve. He heard an unearthly chime, like 1,000 crystal glasses shattering in slow motion, and a new figure appeared on one of the screens. It was taller, more defined, its form seeming to draw light into itself rather than reflect it. It moved with a terrible authority, its presence silencing the other whispers, replacing them with a single, resonant hum that vibrated in Arthur's very bones. This one, he knew, was the leader. The ultimate buyer. It stopped directly in front of the main entrance camera, its form filling the screen. And then, slowly, impossibly, it seemed to press against the camera, distorting the image, making the lens fog and crackle. Its voice, or rather, the impression of its voice, resonated directly in his mind, clear and cold as a winter stream. Give us your soul, Arthur. It is time for the final transaction. He could feel a cold pressure against the steel door of his booth, a subtle vibration that matched the pulse of dread in his veins. The air grew frigid, and the scent of ozone and something akin to burnt sugar filled his nostrils. He could feel tears streaming down his face, hot against the sudden chill. he was trapped. The sun was still hours away, a distant, mocking promise. The mall, this beacon of commerce by day, had become a mausoleum of souls by night, and he was the unwilling exhibit. He knew then that the promise of no living soul getting inside applied only to the start of his shift. These things, these buyers, they weren't living souls. They were something else entirely. Something that had always been there, lurking in the shadows of desire, waiting for the right moment, for the right soul. He closed his eyes, pressing his hands over his ears, desperate to block out the whispers, the chilling demand. But they were inside his head now, a chorus echoing in the hollow chambers of his skull. He could feel the cold seeping into him, could taste the metallic tang of fear on his tongue. He was sure he could feel a presence, a formless entity, reaching for him, probing at the edges of his consciousness. On the screens, the figures pressed closer to the cameras, their forms coalescing, becoming almost transparently solid, their hunger palpable. The lead figure, still filling the main entrance screen, seemed to extend a hand, a gesture of undeniable invitation, or an inescapable grasp. He didn't know how much time had passed, whether minutes or hours. His perception of reality was fractured, his mind a battlefield of terror and desperate hope. He just knew he had to survive until dawn, until the lights came back on, until the first human sound, the first faint whisper of the outside world, broke the spell of this endless night. He clung to that thought, that fragile hope, as the cold deepened, as the whispers grew into a howl in his mind. As the very essence of Arthur felt as though it was being drawn from him, molecule by agonizing molecule. When the sun finally did begin its hesitant descent, painting the edges of the mall skylights with a faint, bruised purple, the whispers did not cease immediately. They merely began to recede, like a tide pulling back from a blood-stained shore. The figures on the screens blurred, softened, becoming once again indistinct, like smudges on a dirty window, before fading altogether. The oppressive cold began to lift, slowly, agonizingly, and the scent of ozone dissipated. Arthur was found there, hours later, by the morning crew. He was slumped in his chair, eyes wide and vacant, staring at the now blank monitors. His skin was ashen, almost translucent. His hands still clutched the small crucifix, his knuckles white. He was breathing, that much was certain, but it was shallow, ragged, as if each breath was an immense effort. He was alive, yes, but something was different. The spark in his eyes, the subtle light of a living, breathing man, had been dimmed, almost extinguished. He never spoke of that night again, not truly. When asked, he would only mumble about a long, hard shift, a faulty system, the exhaustion. But sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, you could see his gaze drift towards the mall's vast, silent interior, even in the bustling daylight. And for a fleeting moment, a shadow would pass over his eyes, a profound, lingering terror that spoke of an encounter with something ancient, something hungry, something that still might be waiting, just beyond the edge of perception. And you, the listener, could never quite shake the feeling that perhaps, that night, Arthur had indeed made a very special kind of transaction, and the full payment was yet to be collected. You listened carefully, and that's good. I think the scariest thing about these stories isn't the ghosts, or the monsters. The scariest thing is when you stop trusting your own mind. Is what you're seeing real? Or is it just your imagination? I have a story that made me think about this question. It's about young guys who wanted to vlog in an old shopping mall. They were confident they could control the situation. But something went wrong with their plans. What if everything they saw was real? It was a story I heard, mind you, passed along in hushed tones late one night, a tale of foolish bravado and consequences whispered in the dark. The details, of course, were gleaned from fragmented accounts, from the shadowed recesses of local lore, and from a certain unsettling video that briefly surfaced online before vanishing as quickly as a ghost in a flickering light. It concerned a group of teenagers, restless and full of that particular brand of youthful arrogance that believes itself invincible, who sought to challenge the spectral reputation of the old Hawthorne Mall. They called themselves the Urban Phantoms. Ironically, given their stated mission was to debunk the very phantoms people claimed to see. Their blog, a flimsy online testament to their daring, chronicled their excursions into derelict factories and forgotten tunnels. But Hawthorne Mall, they agreed, was to be their magnum opus. It wasn't just abandoned, it was cursed, or so the local whispers went. A place where echoes of a vibrant past clung like cobwebs, refusing to entirely dissipate. There were 4 of them: Liam, the self-appointed leader, always with a camera glued to his hand, a meticulous planner who believed logic could conquer any fear; Chloe, the pragmatic one, whose initial skepticism was slowly eroded by the inexplicable; Sam, the jester of the group, whose quick wit and sarcastic quips were usually a shield against genuine apprehension; and Maya, the quiet observer, whose sensitivity, some said, bordered on the preternatural. On that particular evening, under the shroud of a waxing crescent moon, they slipped through a broken service entrance at the rear of the mall, a passage Liam had meticulously scouted weeks prior. The air inside was immediately cooler, thicker, laden with the metallic tang of decay and the musty scent of forgotten dreams. Their powerful flashlights cut through the absolute blackness, revealing a landscape of shattered glass, overturned mannequins, and dusty retail graves. Liam, ever the director, had asked them to whisper their initial impressions for the camera, stressing the need for authenticity. He wanted to capture the contrast between their fearless entry and their eventual debunking of the mall's legends. Chloe had mumbled something about the silence being oppressive, unlike any other abandoned place they had explored, a sentiment Maya had quietly affirmed, suggesting it felt less like emptiness and more like a held breath. Sam, predictably, had joked about the lingering smell of teenage angst and cheap popcorn. They navigated the echoing concourses, their footsteps amplified by the vast, cavernous spaces. Dust motes danced in their flashlight beams, like microscopic spirits performing an ancient ritual. They passed the skeletal remains of what were once bustling storefronts, a toy store with a cracked sign, a clothing boutique with mannequins frozen in absurd poses, a jewelry shop whose display cases lay shattered, their contents long plundered. Liam's steady narration for the camera spoke of the mall's economic failure, its architectural flaws, the perfectly rational reasons for its demise. He was determined to prove that the legends were born of overactive imaginations, fueled by the sheer desolation of the place. Their path eventually led them to the food court, a central plaza beneath a vast, grimy skylight that now offered only a sliver of distant moonlight. This, they had decided, would be their primary location for filming. It was the heart of the mall's former life, a place where families gathered, where laughter and chatter had once reverberated. Now, it was a tableau of frozen despair. Overturned tables, chairs scattered like fallen dominoes, and the skeletal remains of fast food counters greeted them. A layer of grime covered everything, thick as felt. Liam, panning his camera slowly, commented on the undeniable atmosphere, calling it creepy, sure, but not supernatural. Chloe had agreed, albeit with a slight tremor in her voice that she tried to suppress. Sam had loudly declared that the only thing scary was the thought of eating a hot dog from this place now, trying to inject some levity. Maya, however, had simply stood still, her gaze drifting towards the darker corners, her breathing shallow. It was perhaps a minute or two after their arrival, as Liam was setting up a shot by a particularly unsettling pile of collapsed plastic chairs, that the first anomaly occurred. From the shattered remains of what might have been a child's play area, nestled in a forgotten corner near the former ice cream parlor, came a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It was a soft, rhythmic click-clack, distinct against the omnipresent silence. Sam, ever the first to react, had pointed his flashlight towards the source, muttering that it must be a rat, or perhaps just a loose piece of the ceiling. But as the beam settled, they saw it. A small, faded plastic toy, a wind-up clown with a missing eye, lay face down on the dusty floor. And yet, Its tiny mechanical legs were moving, ever so slightly, creating the soft sound. Chloe had immediately suggested it was the wind, perhaps a draft from some hidden opening causing it to vibrate. Liam, ever the rationalist, had agreed, explaining that the mall was full of strange drafts. He had walked over, carefully positioning his camera to capture the toy, and nudged it with his foot. The movement stopped. He proclaimed the mystery solved, a simple coincidence, almost disappointed by the lack of supernatural drama. But then, as they turned to resume filming their introductory segment, a new sensation washed over them. A smell. It was subtle at first, then grew stronger, unmistakable. The rich, savory aroma of freshly baked pizza, mingling with the sweet, sugary scent of cinnamon rolls. It was so real, so potent, that it seemed someone had just slid a piping hot tray out of an oven. Liam had sniffed the air, confused, saying that it was impossible, that the place had no power, no working kitchens. Chloe had wondered aloud whether it was some sort of chemical decay, a bizarre byproduct of the mall's slow decomposition. Sam, his earlier bravado faltering, had just stared at the empty counters, his mouth slightly agape, remarking that he was suddenly incredibly hungry and that it was messing with his head. Only Maya remained silent, her eyes scanning the empty space, a faint shiver running down her spine. The smells lingered, so vivid they could almost taste them on their tongues, before slowly, inexplicably, fading away as if carried off by an unseen breeze. The next phenomenon was far less ambiguous and far more unsettling. A faint, clear sound of children's laughter. It wasn't a distant, muffled echo. It was distinct, playful, almost tangible. It seemed to emanate from a cluster of shadowed booths near the far wall of the food court, where thick darkness pooled despite their powerful lights. Liam had immediately swung his camera towards the sound, commanding them to be quiet, to listen. Chloe had clutched her arms around herself, whispering that it sounded like a recording, maybe some hidden speaker or a prank. Sam, for once, had no witty retort. His face was a mask of growing unease. They had moved cautiously towards the sound, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive gloom. The laughter continued, light and innocent, punctuated by what sounded like the thud of small feet running. It was so convincing, so vibrant, that it momentarily dispelled the chilling emptiness of the mall, replacing it with a sensation of uncanny life. But as they drew closer, as their light beams pierced the deepest shadows, the laughter began to recede. It didn't stop abruptly. It simply moved, drifting further into the darkness, deeper into the maze of abandoned stores beyond the food court. They pressed on, following the elusive sounds, their own breathing now ragged and loud in their ears. Liam kept telling them that it was an echo, a trick of the acoustics in the vast space, instructing them to keep moving, to find the source. Yet each time they thought they were upon it, the sound would move again, always just out of reach, always retreating into a new pool of shadow. Eventually it simply vanished, leaving them in a profound, ringing silence that felt heavier, more oppressive than before. They stood in a forgotten arcade, surrounded by skeletal remains of defunct game machines, their screens blank and dead. The air felt colder here, prickling their skin. It was then, as they debated whether to return to the food court or push deeper into the mall, that Sam first saw them. He had been shining his powerful flashlight into a particularly dark corridor, his hand trembling slightly. He had gasped, a choke sound, then quickly brought his hand up to shield his eyes, claiming he had seen something move, just a flicker, a trick of the light. Liam had immediately dismissed it, suggesting Sam was letting his imagination get the better of him. Chloe, however, had noticed the genuine fear in Sam's voice, a stark contrast to his usual joking demeanor. She had asked him what he thought he saw, gently urging him to describe it. Sam had insisted that he had seen figures, small, indistinct, darting between the tables in the food court behind them. He had described them as children, or at least, appearing to be children, moving with impossible speed, almost like blurs. He had shaken his head, explaining that it was probably just his flashlight beam catching on dust or shadows. They had decided, then, to retreat to the food court, convinced that exploring further into the mall's depths was a bad idea for the moment. But as they made their way back, the sense of being watched intensified. The silence was no longer empty. It was laden with a presence, a heavy, expectant quiet that seemed to press in on them from all sides. Back in the food court, Liam tried to regain control, reminding them that they were there to debunk, not to invent ghosts. He had started filming again, trying to sound authoritative, explaining to his unseen audience that the mind plays tricks in desolate places. But even he seemed to struggle with the conviction in his voice. Sam, meanwhile, had grown increasingly agitated. He kept turning his head, his flashlight beam sweeping erratically. He then pointed a trembling finger towards a cluster of tables near the main entrance, blurting out that he saw them again, more clearly this time. He described small, pale forms, flitting between the overturned chairs, their movements quick and silent. He stressed that they weren't fully formed, more like distortions in the air, but undeniably there, and undeniably numerous. Chloe had tried to rationalize it, asking him if it wasn't just the dust, or perhaps reflections from the skylight. But Sam was adamant, his voice cracking as he reiterated that he could see them, that they were there, playing. Maya, who had barely spoken since the laughter, suddenly squeezed Chloe's arm, her eyes wide, whispering that they were not alone, that the children were scared, or perhaps hungry. With each passing minute, the easy camaraderie of the group dissolved. Their jokes had stopped. The playful sarcasm was gone, replaced by a raw, primal fear that gnawed at their composure. Liam, seeing Sam's genuine terror and Maya's withdrawn dread, finally conceded that perhaps they had seen enough for one night. He had suggested they pack up and leave. But leaving, it turned out, was not as straightforward as entering. They retraced their steps, or at least they tried to. The exit they had used, the broken service door, seemed to elude them. Every corridor looked the same, a repeating pattern of decaying storefronts and deepening shadows. The mall, which they had navigated with such confidence on the way in, now felt like a shifting labyrinth. Panic began to set in. Liam, who had always been so rational, started questioning their route, asking if they had taken a wrong turn. Chloe tried to consult her phone, only to discover there was no signal, not even a faint flicker. Sam was openly whimpering now, pointing his flashlight frantically into every dark recess, convinced he saw the fleeting figures of children in their peripheral vision, always just at the edge of the light. Maya had simply curled into herself, occasionally muttering about the cold, and about how the children missed their parents, and how they just wanted to play. Her words, though fragmented, sent a fresh wave of dread through the others. They ran, eventually, or at least stumbled, through the endless corridors, the silence broken only by their ragged breathing and the thudding of their own hearts. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe. Every distant sound became a child's whisper, every shift in the air a fleeting touch. They no longer cared about their blog, their video, or debunking legends. Their sole, desperate objective was to escape the overwhelming sense of being trapped, of being observed by unseen eyes, of being hunted by playful, spectral children. The story I heard doesn't end with a clear resolution. Some said they made it out, disheveled and traumatized, forever changed by what they did or did not see. Others claimed they were never seen again, vanishing into the local lore they had so flippantly attempted to discredit. The video, as I mentioned, surfaced for a brief, unsettling moment, showing only blurred footage, frantic camera shakes, and guttural screams before it was taken down, or perhaps, just ceased to exist. All that remained, for the one who told me this tale, was the chilling memory of a place that refused to be merely abandoned, a place where the echoes of childhood laughter and the phantom scent of pizza lingered, an eternal playground for the forgotten, and a terrifying trap for those who dared to trespass. As for whether they managed to get out of that cursed place alive, well, that's a question that still hangs heavy in the air, a whisper on the wind, forever unanswered. You know, I told you about everything, the electricians, the security guard, and the teenagers saw. I told you about disappearances, about madness, about something incomprehensible. And you listened carefully. That's because you know that these stories are not just fairy tales. You know that there's more to every abandoned place than meets the eye. But the scariest thing is that it's not just about places. It's about us. About what we leave behind. Sometimes when we want to forget something, it stays and waits. Sometimes it turns into something that will never let go. I'll tell you one last story. And it's about how a person found what they were looking for. And how they lost it. They say you were always a creature of the forgotten, drawn to the hushed decay of what once thrived. They told me you found a particular beauty in the skeletons of malls, those monuments to fleeting desires now left to the dust and shadow. You, the discerning art dealer, saw more than just trash and the discarded remnants of consumerism. You saw stories, dormant memories, potential. This is what they said about you, before the mirror. It was a Tuesday, he remembered, when you first spoke of the Northwood Galleria. Not the glitzy new developments, but the one that had been shuttered for a decade, its once bright atrium now a cavern of broken glass and bird nests. He said you described the air, thick and sweet with the scent of damp concrete and ancient plastics, a perfume unique to urban ruins. You ventured there often, a solitary figure with a powerful flashlight and an insatiable eye for the obscure. The man who owned the wrecking company, a burly fellow with a perpetual grimace, had given you carte blanche, knowing you'd only take what no one else wanted, and perhaps clear a path or two for his demolition crews. He often wondered aloud what exactly you saw in those places, but never truly waited for an answer. That particular day, they recalled you saying, the silence of Northwood Galleria had been heavier, almost expectant. The sun, a pale winter disk, barely pierced the grime-streaked skylights, leaving vast swathes of the mall in perpetual twilight. You navigated the collapsed ceilings and shattered storefronts with practiced ease, your boots crunching on fallen debris, a rhythm punctuating the profound stillness. Department stores, gaping mall-like, revealed shelves picked clean, mannequins toppled like fallen gods. The food court lay entombed beneath a cascade of plaster and rebar, its plastic tables still bearing the ghostly imprints of forgotten families. You had been drawn, they said, to what was once a high-end furniture and decor outlet, nestled away on the second floor, a section the demolition crews hadn't yet touched. The heavy glass doors, though intact, were coated in a decade of dust, obscuring the interior. Your flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a space that seemed miraculously preserved, almost untouched by the general desolation. Velvet drapes, faded but still opulent, hung from high windows. Grand display cases, emptied of their wares, stood like silent sentinels. And then you saw it. Tucked away in a shadowed alcove, almost as if deliberately hidden, stood a towering mirror. It was not like the cheap, mass-produced glass you usually encountered. This was an antique, with a frame of intricately carved, dark wood, heavy and ornate, suggesting an age far predating the mall itself. Its surface, though clouded with years of dust, held an unusual depth, a subtle distortion that piqued your collector's instinct. You remembered the exact sensation, the narrator would later tell me, a shiver that wasn't from the cold, but from something deeper, a recognition. You spent the better part of an hour carefully cleaning it, one of your rare moments of sustained physical effort. As the dust and grime gave way, the mirror's true nature began to emerge. The glass itself was of an unusual hue, a smoky, almost obsidian sheen that seemed to drink the meager light. And when you finally stepped back to observe your work, your breath hitched, your heart quickened. For a moment you saw yourself, or rather, the idea of yourself, a silhouetted figure, indistinct, like a memory half recalled. But then, as your eyes adjusted, your own reflection wasn't there. Instead, the mirror showed something else. It wasn't the dusty mall behind you, nor was it a blank slate. It was a shifting landscape of muted colors and vague shapes, like a dream seen through a veil. A flicker of movement, a suggestion of a vast, empty city, unfamiliar yet strangely resonant. You told yourself it was a trick of the light, an anomaly of the antique glass. But the feeling of profound unease, the narrator observed, had already begun to take root. Despite the unsettling nature of its reflection, or perhaps because of it, your resolve to acquire the mirror solidified. He heard you muttering about its unique aesthetic, how it transcended mere decoration to become a piece of profound, unsettling art. You managed to carefully dismantle it from its wall mounting, the frame heavier than you anticipated, and with considerable effort, maneuvered it out of the mall, the grimace on the wrecking company owner's face deepening when he saw what you were taking. He had apparently asked if you were sure you wanted that thing, saying it felt cold even in the summer heat, but you had merely nodded, your attention already elsewhere. Back in your workshop, a converted warehouse space that served as both gallery and living quarters, the mirror stood against a bare brick wall, dominant and silent. You had initially placed it there, intending to clean it further, to study its unusual properties, perhaps even research its origins. But the research never quite happened. Instead, you found yourself drawn to it, compelled to gaze into its depths, hour after solitary hour. The initial, vague landscapes within its surface began to coalesce. First, they were fleeting, like glimpses of an unfamiliar world. Then, they started to sharpen, taking on a clarity that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. You would see a sprawling, empty mansion, vast rooms echoing with an impossible silence, a scene that stirred a deep, wordless fear of ultimate loneliness within you. Or perhaps a sudden, stark image of your hands, gnarled and frail, fumbling with a handful of tarnished coins, a vision of poverty and decay that spoke to your deep-seated anxiety about financial ruin, a fear you had long buried beneath your curated existence. The mirror became a portal, not to another place, but to the deepest recesses of your own mind. It didn't just reflect your fears, it manifested them. The narrator recounted how you would stand before it, frozen, watching scenes unfold that were too personal, too raw, to be mere chance. You saw the ghost of your estranged father, his face etched with disappointment, whispering words of failure you had heard in your youth. You witnessed your gallery, thriving and bustling, suddenly empty, the curated art pieces shrouded in cobwebs, a stark image of your artistic irrelevance. These visions, they said, were not abstract. They were specific, echoing your unspoken nightmares with horrifying precision. Yet, the mirror was not solely a conduit for terror. It also began to show you your desires, glittering and seductive. You would see yourself lauded at a prestigious art exhibition, critics clamoring for your attention, praising your innovative eye and profound understanding of forgotten beauty. You would witness vast sums of money flowing into your accounts, the financial security you craved, earned not through obscure acquisitions but through a celebrated, undisputed genius. And sometimes, most dangerously, it would show you a different path, a different life, one where certain pivotal choices, a forgotten love, a path not taken, had unfolded differently, leading to a profound sense of fulfillment and joy. A life you had always secretly believed was just beyond your reach. The shift, the narrator noted, was subtle at first. You found yourself less interested in actual art dealing, more in the mirror's nightly performances. The real world began to seem dull, lacking the vivid intensity of the mirror's reflections. He told me that when your business partner, a pragmatic woman named Eleanor, called to inquire about overdue invoices, you would offer curt, distracted replies saying you were occupied with a sensitive acquisition. She apparently heard a strange, faraway quality in your voice, a detachment that worried her. She had asked you once if you were all right, explaining that you sounded tired, even lost, but you had simply dismissed her concerns, saying you were merely focused. The mirror's pull grew stronger, more insistent. It began to hum, a low, resonant frequency that vibrated through your bones when you were near it. Its surface would shimmer, almost invitingly, like disturbed water. You tried to resist, they said, You covered it with a heavy canvas tarp, but even then, you felt its presence, a faint warmth radiating through the fabric, a whisper in the quiet of the workshop. You turned it to face the wall, but the images seemed to burn through the glass, imprinting themselves on the brick, a faint, ghostly afterimage visible only to you. Your attempts to ignore it were futile. It had become a part of your daily rhythm, an unshakable presence. The visions became more intertwined, fear and desire blurring into a single, intoxicating hallucination. It would show you the success you craved, but only at the cost of your soul, represented by a shadowy figure lurking in the background of your triumphs. It displayed the familial love you yearned for, but with the faces of those you had wronged, their expressions twisted with accusation. The mirror was no longer just reflecting your mind, it was actively shaping it, weaving new narratives of terror and temptation. You stopped eating regularly, your sleep became fitful, punctuated by dreams that mimicked the mirror's waking horrors. Eleanor, they said, eventually came to the workshop, concerned. She had apparently tried to reason with you, asking what was happening, saying you looked unwell, almost spectral. She had tried to touch the mirror, to examine it, but you had apparently recoiled, urging her to keep her distance, saying it was too delicate, too volatile. She had left, shaking her head, muttering about contacting your family, though you had no one close enough to truly intervene. One evening, as the last vestiges of twilight bled from the skylights, painting the workshop in shades of bruised purple and gray, you found yourself standing before the mirror once more. Its surface was no longer merely reflecting, it was alive. The smoky glass swirled, coalescing into a vortex of deep, dark colors. The humming intensified, vibrating not just through your body, but through the very foundations of the warehouse. It felt like the world was breathing around you, expanding and contracting with each beat of your frantic heart. The images within the mirror flashed with blinding speed, your greatest fear, an agonizing, public failure, followed by your deepest desire, universal adoration. The line between what was real and what was merely reflected dissolved. A hand, not your own, yet undeniably a part of you, seemed to reach out from the shimmering abyss, beckoning. It was a hand of immense power, of knowing. You felt a profound sense of dread, a terror that rooted you to the spot, yet beneath it, a desperate yearning, a hunger to finally touch the fulfillment, the understanding that the mirror promised. The narrator paused here often, saying this was where the details became hazy, where the line between what you saw and what was became indistinct. They said you described the air around you growing heavy, thicker than any smog, almost viscous. The hum of the mirror became a roar in your ears, a siren song that drowned out all other thoughts, all instincts of self-preservation. The shimmering surface rippled violently, stretching, distending, no longer flat glass but a liquid membrane, a gateway. And then, you were pulled in. It wasn't a sudden, violent yank, but a smooth, inexorable drawing. A sensation, he heard you recall, of falling upward, of being stretched thin across an infinite canvas. Colors exploded around you, then collapsed into absolute blackness. There was the momentary panic of suffocation, then a liberating release, as if you had shed your very skin, your very memories, leaving only a core of pure consciousness. When the sensation ceased, you found yourself standing in what felt like a vast, empty reflection of your own workshop. The brick walls were the same, but somehow flatter, devoid of texture. The skylights were there, but offered no light, only an oppressive gray. The air was still, silent, yet you felt a profound resonance, like a tuning fork vibrating in a vacuum. It was your world, stripped bare, hollowed out. And there, standing before another, identical mirror against the spectral brick wall, was you. Not a distorted reflection, not a ghostly image, but another self. He stood with his back to you, perhaps a few yards away, perfectly still. This other you was dressed in clothes you might have worn, a dark, practical jacket, worn trousers, but they seemed to hang with a different weight, a subtle difference in cut and fabric that spoke of a different life. As this other self slowly turned, you noted the subtle distinctions. His eyes, though the same shade as yours, held a deeper, almost ancient weariness, yet also a fierce, unwavering glint of something akin to triumph or despair, you couldn't tell which. His face was a touch sharper, his body perhaps a little leaner, as if refined by harsher winds or more relentless endeavors. He looked at you, your counterpart, with an expression that conveyed not surprise, but a profound, knowing recognition. There was no need for words, the narrator explained, for his presence communicated everything. He seemed to understand your journey, your fears, your desires, as if they were his own, perhaps because they were. He offered no welcome, no hostility, only this deep, unsettling gaze that pierced through you, a mirror reflecting back not an image, but the very essence of your being, stripped bare. The narrator cannot say what transpired next, for the story ends there, in that vast, empty space, with you standing before yourself, a stranger in a familiar form, a reflection of a life unlived or a life lived too fully. What did he see in your eyes? What did you see in his? Did he beckon you, draw you further into his silent world? Or was it merely an acknowledgement, a confrontation with a path that could have been, or might still be? The mirror in your workshop, they say, stands there still. Eleanor eventually called the authorities after you failed to answer any of her desperate calls. She had apparently found the warehouse unlocked, the air within thick with that same strange hum you had described. The police had found nothing but the towering mirror, its surface now completely blank, perfectly still, reflecting only the mundane brick wall, waiting. But they could not account for you, for your sudden, utter disappearance. They say it waits, patient and silent, the ultimate canvas for the fears and desires of whatever soul next dares to gaze into its depths, forever lost in the stories it tells, and the worlds it creates. Do you know why I told you these stories? I didn't tell them to scare you. I told them because I think they're stories about you. About your friends, about your fears, about what you're leaving behind. Remember that you can always leave. You can leave a place, you can leave a house, but you can never leave what lives in your head. It will follow you. It will look at you from every mirror. And it will wait for you to finally look at it. Good night.